And welcome back to the Midday Show. I am Jeff Everett. He is Mark Messina. As the summer winds down, and we just had a news story released here, so we thought we'd talk about a couple of things that are kind of on like parents' minds, people's minds as we head back into school. We're going to talk about kind of COVID and where we're at a year and a half in. We're going back into school. I don't know if people ever thought we would really be doing this for like a third school year. So we're going to dive into that. And we're also going to talk about critical race theory, as we just put out a piece a little bit ago by our news editor talking about the Montoursville School Board non-vote on critical race theory. So we're going to dive into both of those topics here shortly. But the most important question of every day, and Mark will let you know that it is the most important question of every day. Mark, how are you feeling today?
And as pretty much every day, I feel good. I know that this is going to be like a boring intellectual day for those people who find intellectual stuff to be boring. But there is like Montoursville just hashed it out at a school board meeting that I was not at, but our news director was. But this is a topic they talked about on the Bill Maher show the other day when I was with Ben Shapiro. I couldn't think of his first name for a second. They talked about critical race theory. So this is something that's all over the country. I was just reading about, school boards in the Midwest, and it's a 40-year-old topic that's just become a hot button now. So yeah, I mean, we do have other news we could talk about. Stevie Nicks just canceled her tour.
Yes.
Because her tour. She was going to do 5 shows.
We'll definitely dive into that when we talk about COVID. Because I think she's the first of many that are about to do it.
I do want to mention this because I failed to mention this yesterday. And just on a lighter topic, I don't know if you know this, I like baseball.
I've heard.
The Kansas City Royals did something the other night that has never been done in the modern era of baseball. And when people talk about the modern era of baseball, it's 1900 and beyond. So even if you don't know baseball, you can impress people with that.
Okay.
They were losing and rallied to tie in the 7th inning, 8th inning, 9th inning, and 10th inning. In the same game, 4 innings around, boom, losing, tie, losing, tie, losing, tie. No one had ever done that in the history of baseball. Partially because it's hard to give up runs every inning, like just get some people out, and it's hard to rally. You have to be losing to rally. But anyway, anything, because baseball, each team plays 162 games. There are thousands of games a year. And anything that happens for the first time in the modern era is cool. And it happened Monday night. And then they rallied to tie in the 7th inning, 8th inning, 9th inning, 10th inning, then they lost anyway in the 11th inning. So that's kind of a funny little anecdote.
I'm just not that impressed. I just don't think it's that
in the history in the last 121 years of baseball, it had never happened before. No matter what it is, that's cool. Also, the Orioles right now have given up at least 9 runs, 6 games in a row. And that is tough to do with big league pitching, because it is hard to hit big league pitching. Apparently, the Orioles don't have big league pitching right now.
See, this is why baseball's in trouble, because you just told me 2 things that you thought were cool, and I bet you the majority of people my age do not think it's cool.
Baseball people think it's cool. You're not a baseball guy. So
I'm not a baseball guy, but I know when Ohtani does something, it's cool. I know what's a cool thing in baseball. That I don't know if this is.
If you told a baseball fan that there is a big league team that gave up 9 runs or more 6 games in a row, a baseball fan gets that.
Okay. All right. Let's talk about something that you and I are not sure the majority of people get. And I say that because you and I have had conversations before where we've looked at each other and we're not totally sure we understand what critical race theory is either.
Because we don't.
No. So we educated ourselves. I dug out I was like a madman here the last hour or so, digging in, making sure that I felt good about it and felt confident enough to kind of talk about some of this stuff. I went to the American Bar Association. I read through what our news editor, Carrie Pauling, just released on NorthcentralPa.com. So we're going to dive into some of that, and we're going to open it up with what happened at the Montoursville School Board non-vote last night.
Let's just start with it. They're discussing one of the, and this is not just a Montoursville thing. This is not just a Central Pennsylvania thing. As I said, I've been reading this in the Midwest. This is kind of all over the country. Of should critical race theory be taught in high schools? You will find it called CRT for those people who are. It has been around a while. It is a college course, as I told you when I was watching Bill Maher the other night, and they asked Ben Shapiro, do you know what critical race theory is?
Yep.
He said, yes, because I went to law school and I had a class on it in law school. It's a 40-year-old topic that has been a higher education topic for a long time,
Yes,
especially law students. So the question is, should it be brought into high schools? And then the follow-up question is, well, what the hell is it? And that's where people have, and that was the big thing at the Montoursville school board meeting, like actually coming up with a definition of it is tough.
Yeah, it's a challenge. So the concept of critical race theory was undefined, yet was highly contested during a near 3-hour school board meeting last night. And the biggest concern from people that were opposing it was that there was no true definition necessarily of not only what is critical race theory, but also like how do you handle it, who gauges what is and what isn't. Just a lot of like unattainable, measurable things that if you're running a school district or an organization or anything else, how do you actually decide how to measure it, right? Like who actually is going against said, who is going against said resolution, right? Like it's one thing to introduce a resolution, but then how do you, I don't want to use the word police it, but then how do you actually know if someone is upholding to the resolution if you don't have standards or measurables to decide that? So here's what, I'm not sure, is there anything else you want to touch on as far as like the school board side of it? Okay, so let's do this, because I went to a couple of different places because I kind of found this interesting. And to be honest with you, this was well overdue for me, because as much as I read the news and as much as I dive into things, and I am somebody who kind of gets like tunnel vision when I get into something, this is something that I had never actually dove into. So the basic or standard definition of critical race theory, it is a body of legal scholarship, which you already touched on earlier, talking about Ben Shapiro, and an academic movement of civil rights scholars and activists in the United States who seek to critically examine the intersection of race and U.S. law to challenge the American liberal approaches to racial justice. So the number one thing that I took from this the first time I read that was, this was not necessarily something created off of a whim. This is not something that was necessarily made to be a talking point in America. This was something that 30, 40 years ago was done by a group of scholars looking to become lawyers who were basically challenging the status quo, saying this is something that needs to be talked about when we're actually discussing things in the court of law.
Correct.
Okay.
So that is where the question now goes to high school is, where does this apply to high school? And which is a very fair question. And there are so many angles to go about this. One of the, and I don't even know if this has to do with critical race theory or if this is just a different, kind of a branching hot button topic. But one of the discussions now is we need to teach history more accurately. And there are, the history has been whitewashed. And I just heard like the Tulsa massacre.
Sure.
That I just heard about this year. And we know, it's no secret, that white people have done some very bad things through American history, yes. Whether it was originally to the Native Americans or then to blacks, and then, internment camps and all these things. And so when we discuss, no one debates that history should be taught in school, because if history is not taught, it tends to repeat itself. But then we get into this debate of, well, what history should be taught? And depending on what your ethnicity is, you don't feel that history is being accurately taught.
Sure.
And that's where one of the sticky branches comes out of this discussion as to who decides what history should be taught. Because depending on where you're at, let's be honest, there's a lot of white people that don't want history to be accurately taught.
Sure. So I think there's two different topics to what you just discussed there. One is the omission of history. So there's a lot of history being taught, and some of it is inaccurate. The bigger issue that I have found is the omissions of history. right? Like, so for example, you came in the one day and you were like, had you ever heard of this Tulsa thing? And I was like, yeah, I had heard once before. And you were like, I'd never even heard of it.
No, that's not what you said. You said, of course I had. What kind of moron are you? Have you not?
No, I did not say that. But you were kind of like, I've never even heard of this before. So to me, it is the omissions that are kind of like the bigger issue. And like there are a lot of history classes and different things. And some of it, like having been a teacher before, there are like time limits. You just run like things like that, where like you just can't hit all the bullet points. The irony is sometimes which bullet points get left out and which ones don't, right? So that to me is like the first topic that you have brought up. Where critical race theory comes in, and what I've kind of gathered here is it's the idea of not so much the omissions, not so much the inaccuracy. It is the idea of like, once you and I are discussing a topic, how should race be discussed? How much should it be discussed? And why should it be discussed? And that is kind of the point of critical race theory and how it applies itself to law. And now the question is, should that same thought process or should that same thing now be applied to other things, right? Because critical race theory is supposed to be this kind of like an amoeba. It's supposed to be something that its definition will consistently change as it grows and develops and as we learn more and kind of like develop what it is, okay?
Yes, and I think from the Bar Association one that you read earlier, that it's based in the premise, and this was an interesting topic that I'd never thought about until you actually read it to me from this,
right.
that race is a man-made thing.
So let's hit the 4 points and we'll dive into. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Let's hit the 4 points and we'll dive into each one and kind of, because I find it interesting. So these are the 4. I don't want to call them the key points or the main points because
the 4 pillars of
because I didn't write critical race theory, and who am I to say like these are the 4 like founding pieces? However, according to the American Bar Association, these are the scholars who wrote this. These are the 4 kind of like basic standards of critical race theory, the reason they created it. So the first one is the recognition that race is not biologically real, but is also socially constructed and socially significant. It recognizes that science refutes the idea of biological racial differences, and it's the idea that race is the product of social thought and is not only connected to biological reality.
They're basically saying there's no real difference between a white person, a black person, an Asian person, a Hispanic person. They're all the same biologically. It's almost like, so their skin color's different or their features are different, almost like someone's hair color's different or their eye color's different. That they're all... Yeah. There's no real great difference between a white person, a black person, a Hispanic person.
The simple statement would be that an aesthetic difference does not mean that it wasn't necessarily a social construct that was created. So just because 99.9% of us is biologically identical, the same, that 0.1%, although it is technically like it is a visual representation, right? Like you can't ignore it, like it is there. But their point is that it was basically the things that we believe were the standard, whether it was slavery or racism or things like that. It's the idea that like that was a social construct.
Right. We created it.
Yes.
We've determined that these people are different.
Correct.
When we could have, again, I keep saying we could have picked hair color. We could have picked eye color.
Yeah.
We went with skin color, or in other aspects, we went with religious beliefs or whatever. It's not just skin color. Yes. There's other discriminatory things in life. But it is created by society.
Yes.
And it's not created by nature.
Correct. So that is the first like recognition of like, so the other one is the acknowledgement that racism can be a normal feature of society and is embedded within systems and institutions, for example, like our legal system, that replicate racial inequality. So the basis of the idea that they skip down to is this dismisses the idea that racist incidents are always aberrations, but instead can be manifestations of structural or systematic racism.
So I think basically what they're saying is racism exists.
Yes.
And to racism exists. I don't want to say everywhere, but it is predominant, and it has roots in all. Roots is a bad pun there because of, it has roots in all fabrics, including law. Right. And to pretend that when there's a racist act that, as they said, is the aberration or is the exception to the rule is just not true.
Yes, I would almost, I would say that, I want to make sure that I say it correctly. I would say it's not so much that it's woven into everything, like you kind of hinted at this, but it is the idea that to not question it would be like, it's almost ignorant to not ask the question, right?
Correct.
It's the idea that like there's all these other influences around us, and to act as if racism may not play a part of that is ignorant, right? Like you in order to, because again, this was made up for law practices. Right. So their whole concept is like, how do we make this? How do we find justice? How are we getting to the truth? And so what they're saying is like, to take all these other influences into account, but to ignore this one makes no sense.
Right. There are families where there's no racism. There are businesses where there's no racism. There are, school, but they're saying that there are so many things that are influenced by race that, as you said, to just assume that no racism exists except where you see it is just foolhardy.
Okay. So the third one, and these ones are a little like, oh, I don't want to call them smaller, but those were the two big.
Those are the two
main.
That it's man-made and it's natural. It's the tone of it that I got too. Not to backtrack, is not. It's not even said from a condemning standpoint. It's said from like just this is how it is. Like racism is a natural thing that is woven into our society, and for us to pretend that it's not there is just foolish.
Yes, and it goes along with the third one. The third one, to sum it up, because it's a longer, but it's basically the idea of like, we should not use color blindness as a way to like resolve these issues or to come to justice or come to conclusions, right? So basically the third foundation is like the idea like the worst thing to do is ignore the first two things we talked about.
Right.
So that's number three, which is a little simpler to understand. And then the fourth one and the last one, and you and I had talked about this briefly before the show, it's the recognition of the relevance of people's everyday lives to scholarship. So it's the idea that like you cannot just use numbers and stats to explain racism. The experiences, the history, the past that people have gone through, those things matter just as much, if not more, than any number or statistic that you could slide in front of me. The human experience has to matter, because otherwise, why would you ever have somebody come up to the stand? Right. So it's that idea that people's voices, although you're still trying to find the truth and they're putting their hand down and they're taking the oath before they speak, but it's that idea that the experience is just as valuable as the statistic is kind of like the last foundation.
Well, and so what's happened at the Mentorsville meeting and what's happening at all over the country now, as this is discussed, is we're getting to a point where in school, the word that keeps coming up is divisive. The people, there's a section that feels like critical race theory is trying to divide. And what's unique about this is I think there are people on both sides who think it's that critical race is trying to divide or trying to move things backwards. And one of the topics, but when you come up with the word divisive, and in schools now they talk about things of there are parental groups that are concerned that if anything that's being taught, and where then people are on one side or the other, and where one of the teachers of Mentorsville talked about from a literature department, there are things that could be determined as divisive, classic books from The Kite Runner to Huck Finn to, all kinds of literature that discuss race and discuss, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and discuss these historically hot button topics where there's, and she even said that's not even discussing social studies. If we are if we are not allowed to discuss possibly divisive topics in school, then social studies teachers can't discuss upcoming elections. Now, I understand that the social studies teacher should not try to implement he should not try to convince the students to vote the way he or she votes just because but you still need to be able to discuss it and discuss both sides and discuss this campaign platform as opposed to this campaign platform. And there's a group of there seems like a growing number of parents who don't want anything discussed at school that is different than what we believe at home. And that is really the underlying motive between all this.
So, and we're going to come back because let's go back one step further, because I think one of the key things, and Carrie kind of hits this in the article today about this, and you can find it at NorthcentralPa.com. There's this idea also of like, when you say like, I don't know if it's actually being taught in schools. I started going through my head and trying to think of like the lessons that I had and things that I've been taught like through high school and college. And I was trying to think of times where I was actually taught critical race theory, like what we just defined,
right,
and what we just talked about. And I honestly don't know if I was. Like, I'm trying to think a time where we actually talked about like racism, how to handle racism, like what do you like, who like the historical references of like Tulsa, slavery, things like that. Like even when we learned about the Civil War, we were told racism was one of the reasons that the Civil War broke out, but we never talked about it. Like we never actually discussed like racism and how it led into the Civil War and what happened afterwards. And like we learned about specific legislation within the administration of the United States and things like that, but we never actually talked about critical race theory or how racism.
It's because like history is, I mean, there are dates, there are things that are indisputable, but there's lots. My freshman year, I went to James Madison, which is in Virginia, which is in the South. And I had a history class, and there's still debates. This was 1991. Maybe it was the fall. Maybe it was 1990. But there are still debates. What caused the Civil War? And they talk about economics, and they talk about this. And our professor, who was an old school Virginian, he's like, the Civil War, you can pull everything else away. It was about slavery. The Civil War, because everything else, the economy was revolved around slavery. The culture revolved around slavery. Everything. So you can label it everything else, but slavery was under it. But there are debates that people have and say, well, what caused the Civil War? And that's one of the aspects of teaching history or teaching social studies, that it's not just about facts, that there is conjecture in what your beliefs are, what my beliefs are. I never really thought about this until I was married, but my mother-in-law, my ex-mother-in-law, however you want to say it, is British, was born in England, and my father-in-law was U.S. military. So as her kids were raised all over the world, because he was still active military, but on American military bases, and she would say, the way you teach World War II is very different than the way we teach World War II. So we also get to that as Americans. We're like, well, there's a factual history of World War. Well, the factual history, there's a lot of nuance, and as they always say, the winner gets to write the history books. So there is that understanding that in a lot of these subjects, there is not just fact. It's 2 + 2 is 4. We can do that. But when you start talking about history and social studies, it's a lot of open to interpretation.
So I guess my question then would be, and like, this isn't even like, I don't even think I'm disagreeing. Like, I don't even think this is like a devil's advocate question. I think there's a confounding misinterpretation of teaching critical race theory versus actually like teachers using critical race theory to then decide how they're going to teach the subject in the best way possible. Because a lot of what critical race theory, like if you're approaching it from like the American Bar Association and what we just read, and you're approaching it in the court of law, to approach it then into the classroom, it's not that you are teaching critical race theory. It's that you are using critical race theory to ask yourself, am I teaching this in the best manner possible? And it's asking you to do so in a manner in which, like, are you doing this for political benefit? Are you doing this because of your moral beliefs? Or it's trying to get rid of that and just say, this is a part of history, and you need to consider this when you're actually teaching the subject. Not to teach critical race theory, but to consider it as a teacher or as an adult, depending on what you're teaching or what your organization is working on.
And I think, to go one step further back to the parental aspect, there is a section of society who it is vital to the parent. Like, let me backtrack. Strike all that from the record. I had a buddy in college who was very bright, and he was one of like 5 kids. And he's like, my mom's understanding is I'm going to teach my kids like the best I can about what I think they should understand about life. And then I understand they are going to go out in life. They're going to make their own decisions. They're going to draw their own conclusions. They're going to make their own mistakes. Like, it's not my job as a parent to shield them so much and confine them so much they don't make any mistakes. It's my job to prepare them to, like, open-mindedly go out and see the world for what they think it is and live their life. And I think there's a lot of, I don't know how many parents, but there are parents who it is vital to them that their kids think the way they think, especially politically. And the aspect of that the underlying undercurrent of all this is that they are afraid that their kid is going to hear a different viewpoint at school than the viewpoint that the parents have, and that the kid might then think differently than the parents do. Not that it's even opposite of what the parents do, but if a kid is a little more conservative or a little more liberal than what the parents think, and the kid doesn't agree with every stance that the parents have, that the parents now feel like they have lost and they are failures, as opposed to just accepting the fact that my kid's life experience is going to be different than mine. My kid's influences are going to be somewhat different than mine. And it's okay if my kid doesn't think exactly the same way as I think.
Yes. There's not a disconnect. I would say that, like, the point that you're making, I don't know if I would, like, directly attach it to critical race theory, but I think parents do.
Correct. I agree with that.
So I from that standpoint, I agree with what you're saying. This is what kind of, like, wrapping it up and kind of, like, diving into this now.
Because we've made this way too boring and intellectual.
No, not at all. I think critical race, like, I think one of the biggest disconnects is the idea that critical race theory itself, like actual critical race theory, there cannot be, like in the United States, there cannot be more than a handful of schools that are actually going over critical race theory. Like it's
a law school topic.
The actual American Bar Association. Now, I would like to think that teachers who have a college degree, who most of them have grad degrees, and devote their life to, like, what is the best way to educate children, they are having these discussions. Like, they are talking about, like, what is critical race theory? Can it help my lesson plans? Is there something that I am leaving out? Is there something that I'm doing too little or too much of? I would just hope that parents and teachers are using it as kind of like a reflection point or a way to kind of, like, ask those questions. Because I think that's what it is truly intended to do. Like, it's truly intended to ask ourselves, like, right, are we talking about race the correct way? Do we understand race and what it actually is? And I think that's what critical race theory is. I just can't imagine, like, having read this and, like, gone through it, I cannot imagine that there are, like, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th grade classrooms that are truly diving into what is critical race theory.
Well, and the other thing, as you said, is it being taught the right way? that's never a black and white answer. That's never a
Correct,
yes and no answer. It's always has to be like examined and modified, and what's the right way to teach it now. Yes.
It's a reflect. The people that, and I'll keep this tangent to a minimum, the people that have had the greatest influence in my life reflected more than any people I've ever met. In a lot of times they didn't have the right answers. They didn't always know what to say. You just always knew that they were trying to understand something or understand something better than what they had before. And so to me, like the whole, after reading this and kind of going through it, I don't even know necessarily, like, I don't think I've changed my moral standards or my beliefs or how I thought about history before, how we should teach. Like, I don't think any of those things necessarily for me have been shifted. But what I do think that I understand is, like, with critical race theory, these are the things that, like, adults and parents should be asking themselves as they're discussing about, like, what is best for the best way to teach history? What is the best way to talk to our kids about race? What are the best? That's the whole point of what I've taken from this critical race theory. It is the idea of reflection, and are we really understanding how to talk about race, whether it's in the court of law, and eventually as it's spreading, like, I don't think actual critical race theory is in our schools, but I think what's happening is that teachers and administrations and school districts are now having to reflect on what they are teaching and how that is applied to critical race theory.
Right, and I agree. And to go back to, like, what kids believe in the generational thing in their own families, like, I've had this discussion with my kids, like, what do you think? And I think in too many aspects of society that we ask that question, especially parents to kids or coaches to players or parents, however, sure. Like, what do you think? And they give an answer, and the answer is either right or wrong. If you either said what I wanted you to say or you didn't, it's right or wrong. And where the question that I ask to my kids beyond it is, why do you think what you think?
Sure.
And if the reason you think it, it's like a football play. It's on 3rd and 2. Did you run it or did you throw it? I don't really care what you did. I'm just asking the play caller, why did you call what you called? And if you had a good reason for that,
right,
then great. Right. So when I ask my kids, well, why do you believe that? Don't say I believe that because my buddy at school said it. Or don't say I believe it because, if I believe the other way, this girl wouldn't like me. Like, what is if you have an educational or educated belief and you can back up why you feel the way you feel, then that's fine. I would rather have you believe differently than I do, but have a basis for it, than believe what I believe just because you say, well, my dad told me so.
Yes. Now, I will say this, and this is kind of like shoe on the other foot, like a little bit of devil's advocate to the conversation we just had. Just like anything else in society, if it is used for the wrong purposes or people use it to their advantage, it can 100% be divisive. It can 100% not do what it was meant to do when these scholars created critical race theory. So, like, when I think of like when Zuckerberg created Facebook, he had no idea, like, the things that could happen.
He was trying to meet chicks.
Yes.
That was it.
And so, and like, when I think about Amazon and Bezos, like, he had no idea what he had actually created and how far it would go and, like, how important it would be, like, how much of the world he would shape.
He was just trying to sell books, wasn't he?
And listen, anything like that, I would say the same thing about critical race theory. Like, it has to be handled it has to be handled in the correct, like us. We sat down, we said, what is it? What is the definition? How does it work? Where can you apply it? Because just like anything else in this world, when it becomes a topping point, when it becomes a tipping point, it can be used in the wrong manner. It can be used by both sides to be taken advantage of. And that is the one kind of, like, the one downside of this whole critical race theory thing is that I could see people trying to use it on both sides to their advantage, whether it's a talking point, whether it's to get their agenda across, whether it's to kind of, like, I don't want to say, like, mold young minds, but that's what teachers are doing. So from that standpoint, there is a big responsibility with critical race theory and how it is used. And if people are worried about that, like, if people, like you said, people kept using the word divisive and things like that, I can relate to that worry, because if it is being used by the wrong person on either side, it can be manipulated to their
What
advantage.
is the agenda? I'll never forget when I heard this, that they're like, everything has a negative side. They're like, you can't pick anything. You know, exercise. You hear the word exercise and you're like, oh, it's great because people need to exercise more. But if you exercise to an extreme, it is detrimental. You know, people need to drink more water, unless you drink too much water and you kill yourself because you've diluted your blood. Like anything that is, even the things that are seen as extremely positive can be negative. And this is one of those things as well. It's I think too, and this is just back to, this is my blanket political statement. When we get to the point that we spend too much time trying to convince people to come to our side, like people are firmly on this side and they're firmly on that side, and we are trying to recruit. And when instead that we should just get to a point where it's just like, I don't disagree with all your points and you don't disagree with all my points. And what we need is you to just listen. But if you are a conservative ideology, you are probably going to stay a conservative ideology. You know, people are pessimistic or optimistic. People are aggressive or conservative, you know, whatever.
I laugh all the time because I want you to finish your point. I laugh all the time because like when I see like the comments or I talk to people about our show, they'll be like, I can't believe you guys were on this one side. And I laugh all the time because there's a lot of times where you and I end the show and we feel like we don't know what side
we're not on. Yeah,
like
we don't know
feel
what
like we haven't picked a side. So go ahead, continue.
And we're trying to figure out a side.
We're thinking out loud, like we're trying to figure out So that the irony there is pretty funny.
Yeah, what we're trying to do as a society, or what we should try to do as a society, is to just get the other side to listen, because when we can listen to our points and then we can acknowledge the other points, then it doesn't end up being we're all right, you're all wrong, you're all right, we're all wrong. And because even when you get right and left people to talk, it's surprising when you get a right and a left person to talk in a one-on-one conversation how much they agree on, as opposed to when you get the mob mentality that nobody agrees on anything, and that's just not true.
I would say this, regardless of how you feel about critical race theory, because I really didn't have opinion of it until about honestly about 48 hours ago.
Because we sat here a little bit ago, we're like, what is it? We're like, I don't have a definition.
No, I keep reading, but everything I read, there's never like an actual definition of what critical race theory is. So I would encourage people, if you go to the American Bar Association, they actually have like written down what critical race theory is and how it was started and how it was applied to the court of law and kind of the scholars behind it and why, I don't want to say why it became what it is, because it's clearly becoming something that it wasn't meant to be. But it is interesting to go and actually read what the definition of critical race theory is. This is a whole other topic for another day, but it was kind of like when people use the word defund. And when you go and you actually look up, like there's so many different meanings for what defund could mean. And so it's kind of a little bit like that with critical race theory. Like, depending on how you're using it, what you're applying it to, like are you actually teaching critical race theory, or are you telling the teachers to apply it? So many different avenues, so different ways to look at it. I encourage you to go to the American Bar Association and actually like type in critical race theory and read it. It only takes like 10 minutes and it won't even change your mind. Like this isn't like a persuader. It's not going to make you feel differently about it. It's just
give you a baseline. It's
just like a very basic, like, here it is. This is what it is. And it just gives you the opportunity to kind of, and then you can base your opinions around it. Go for it. But it is interesting how it was started and what it actually is.
So you're saying it's like herpes. There's just like 17,000 different variations of it.
I don't even know where to go with that one. There's that many variations?
Did I ever tell you this story? Not now, will lighten the mood a little bit. I was at my annual physical, it's always in August. I have an annual physical coming up. So I'm at my annual physical and I looked at my doctor, who I have a great doctor.
Sure.
And I was like, hey, like when they do this blood work, are they testing for herpes? And she looks at me and she's like, well, you can pay it's not in the baseline.
Right.
You can pay extra for it. And she looks at me, she goes, is there a reason you think you have herpes? And I was like, well, I just read online that 90% of Americans have herpes and don't even know it. And she goes, you're like the fifth person who's asked me about a herpes test, and I couldn't understand why. Okay. She's like, have you ever had a cold sore? Then you have herpes. And she went through all these aspects.
Right.
She's like, when people think of herpes, they think of the sexually transmitted diseases,
sure.
but there's all these. So she goes, I couldn't understand why people kept asking me about this. I was like, I see it on my phone every day that 90%. And I'm thinking, what, 99 out of 10? It's probably me. I probably have it and don't even know it. And she was like, you don't need to get tested. It's okay. Yeah. So that was one of my fun doctor moments. That was a clickbait-ish that sure. I wasn't the only one that was clicking on it.
See, that I had no idea there were that many different
There's a lot.
Or variations. That's unbelievable.
It is like, and I don't know if a cold sore is herpes simplex, whatever. There's that movie. What was the movie like? Herpes simplex 10. I don't know. Just sometime when you're bored and you want to rabbit hole something, Google how many forms of herpes are there. But I had my doctor perplexed, and all because I read something online that said 90% of Americans have it and don't even know it.
That's crazy. Are you like what's the word? Somebody who always thinks they're sick?
Hypochondriac?
Are you a hypochondriac?
No, I'm not actually. I'm like
healthy. The opposite.
I don't take the only medicine I'll take like an Advil if I have a headache once a year. Okay. But most headaches I fight through. But I don't really get headaches. I take allergy medicine and nasal spray because I am so allergic to grass. But that's it. Like I don't take anything else.
I have the opposite problem. I will not admit I'm sick until like I am sick. I almost wait too long.
See,
I'm the dude who like 3 days into the flu, they're finally taking something because they've just like admitted defeat.
See, now I'm not. I do that with headaches.
Okay.
My first reaction, if I feel a headache coming on, I try to go to bed.
Okay.
And sleep it off. But no, when I feel, because as I got to be an adult and I was like, I can't be sick.
Sure.
So I will like kind of get on it unless it's like. And anyone who's been an allergy sufferer like me knows this. Like I've had sinus infections that I'll be several days into the sinus infection and I'm like, this ain't going away. Right. But if you're an allergy sufferer like me, you've spent much of your life not being able to breathe. So when you can't breathe, it's like, it's annoying, but it's just part of life.
Right.
So, but no, I would kind of agree with you from the standpoint. And from an injury standpoint, like when we were kids, how injuries were treated.
Sure.
And nowadays, when kids get a sprained ankle, it is like when we were kids, we were like, go walk it off and tell me if you can keep playing. Maybe we'll wrap it and you'll go. Yeah. Now it's like, oh, you're in a 4-day protocol, and it's society's become much more sensitive from that side of it. And I'm not talking about concussions. We've got a lot better with concussions. We're more sensitive with concussions than we used to be, and it's good because brain injuries we've seen are very dangerous. Yeah. Rolled ankles are not all that dangerous. And, my nephew, we were just playing at the park the other day and rolled his ankle, and he kind of walked it off, and we were like, does he? Like 90 seconds later, he's like, no, I'm good. Let's keep playing. Yeah. And he was fine. Yeah. And I'm not, that doesn't happen as much. That's how we grew up, and that's not how the world is nowadays.
Yeah. Well.
So we tangented very far on that, but
that's all
anyway,
right.
Be that as it may.
That's what it's about. Thinking out loud. Good one.
Not bad. I mean, I thought it was good. I know people. You get into these academic intellect, and it's just boring. But sometimes to some people,
not even boring. It's just people have opinions. You and I have opinions. People have opinions, and sometimes depending on the topic, it just gets
And if
hot.
You're not willing to think about it, like even if you have an opinion. That there are still discussions, there's an other side, and the people who are just like, I am not listening to the other side because they're wrong. I think the underlying, if we had a psychologist, the underlying is I don't want to expose myself to other opinions because I don't want to hear something and think that, oh, maybe I was wrong, or maybe I have to alter my thinking. And that's why I think people close off.
I think that's a part of it. I think the other thing, and you and I talked about this before, it is hard to see a topic and kind of get to the bottom of it. It's hard. You have to look around, you have to go to different places, you have to hear different opinions. it's just so much easier to hear what you want to hear and kind of just agree with it and move on from it. So that's, I mean, the bummer that I always find with topics like this and stuff we talked about 2 weeks ago and like things before that,
which we shall never speak of again.
No, well, I don't know about that. But there's just like my biggest issue is like I've always been interested in kind of like what things are and kind of the different angles and where they bounce off and stuff like that. And what I have learned doing this now, because I said to you, I think today was 142.
You said
we're getting close to 150 episodes in. And I've said to you, like the one thing, I don't mind like people disagreeing. I don't mind people being mad. I don't mind, like, I don't mind any of that. The thing I think that has bummed me out the most in almost 150 episodes is like, there are people like, and you hinted at this, there are people that just don't want to have the conversation if they disagree with it. Like they don't even want to like hear about it. They don't want to talk about it. They would just, and some of my favorite topics are things I disagree with. Because I'm curious and like I want to know why people think differently, and so like I don't know, that's been like the biggest bummer for me, kind of, because I thought what we did today, like looking up the definition and going through it step by step, like that stuff's interesting to me, and I don't even think I necessarily changed my opinion.
Well, I think today was an easy one for us because we basically didn't know, and we're just kind of like explaining what it is. We don't have opinions one way or the other. But the disappointing thing to me, to piggyback on what you were saying, is not just of the people who won't have the discussion, but the people who say like, why would you even want to have this discussion, and are kind of angry that we did, because their way is right and there's no reason to discuss the topics of the other side because I'm right and the other side is crazy.
Yeah. No, I just like to talk about the things that I don't know. I like to talk about the things where like maybe I'm 60-40, but I'm not sure. So like, here's why I'm leaning that way. But I'd like you to try to talk me over.
Because you can learn something that way.
I like that stuff.
And it's kind of fun to learn new things.
I like that stuff.
What the other thing that I found fascinating, and the topic of a couple weeks ago points this out with a lot. We've got to a society where the people that are loud are so aggressively loud that there are people who disagree with the loud people, but they only tell you privately because they don't want to they don't want to deal with the wrath of the loud people who are like, how dare you agree with them?
Right.
And we can tell you from the parade topic, where we had some people that were very loud and angry with us, that we had people from inside the Montgomery Hepburn Little League who privately said to us, we don't really disagree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
But we can't say it out loud.
It's funny, when I was growing up, one of the things, I forget who used to say it to me, but because I can be like, sometimes I'm just naturally, like if you're in a room with me or like we're at a restaurant, like sometimes I'm just naturally a little louder than like the decibel of the room. And they would always say to me, louder isn't righter. And I've always I've
said that a lot being louder doesn't make you more right. Yes, that is absolutely.
And not that pertains to anything you were just talking about. But
no, it is
you made me think of that because, and I have I have some cousins and different people, like they just vocally just like, when they get excited, they just become like a little louder, and I'm that way too. So I've always kind of like kept that in the back of my head.
I've said this one in personal arguments, like, just because you say it over and over doesn't make it more true.
I'm bad at that. I find myself at times, I will say something 2 or 3 times, and I don't know if it's like a security blanket or if it's like, I just don't know where else, like my brain just can't go, but I do that consistently. Yeah. I've tried to get better at it. It's hard though. Like a lot of like little things, like I've noticed, like if I focus on it, I can kind of change it and get better. That is one of them that like in the last like 5 years of my life, I have intrinsically noticed I do it. And I don't know.
It's one that comes up in arguments. I would say probably domestic arguments a lot, because that's where most arguments happen.
Okay.
And to even take it a step further and say, I know you've said that 4 times. I still don't agree with it. And it doesn't make it true. It doesn't help the argument any, but there's times that you need to like kind of feel like you need to put your flag in the ground and say, I don't want you to walk away thinking that I've condoned or I've acquiesced to this point, whatever word I'm looking for.
Yeah. I actually did it on the show a little earlier, probably like 2 or 3 weeks ago, when we were talking about the U.S. women's soccer team. And we were talking about the whole equal pay thing with the guys and all that. And I thought about it before, and I was like, I said the same thing like 3 times.
And you were wrong every time.
Was I?
Probably.
I said, I don't mind being wrong. That part doesn't bother me.
And this is part of the history. The women's soccer team took the bronze. That's a fact. But when you debate all the other reasons, like why did they take the bronze? Why did they leave? Now all of a sudden there's all these opinions and all. You can have good soccer people who can give all these different opinions. So that's why history becomes such a touchy topic to discuss.
Right.
But you can't. It doesn't do society good not to discuss the touchy topics. Yeah. It's just how do we absorb the material? How do we process it? And do we actually give people the freedom to absorb it the way they want, interpret it the way, and believe what they want to believe, or do they have to believe the way I believe? That's the issue.
Yeah. One of the things, because there's a lot of things that we could do better. I think one of the things that I enjoy, like when I'm talking with you or like a few other select people in my life, is I think we're very good at distinguishing, like, here are like the facts, like here are like the concrete things, and then here's my opinion, or here's what somebody else thought. And I've always kind of enjoyed that about our conversation, is kind of that division of like factual, like things we can't change, and then here's how we feel about it. And I don't know. I think it's hard to find people to have those types of conversations with.
I agree. I think cable news and society's making it harder and harder.
Oh yeah.
It's a lot harder now than it used to be.
Which we were going to talk about with COVID. We'll do that tomorrow. We'll do that tomorrow because we want to talk about not so much COVID, but the angle of like, are we so saturated that like it doesn't even...
That we're numb.
Yeah. I mean, I don't even know if it matters what news channels or organizations or hospitals say right now.
You know what matters right now?
From it.
Do you know what matters a whole lot right now?
Lunch. I knew you were going to say that. Lunch. Thank you guys for watching the Midday Show. Thank you to all of our sponsors. And be sure to go to NorthcentralPa.com. Again, you can check out the article on the Montoursville School Board meeting at NorthcentralPa.com for all your local news.
And it's not just, I mean, it was just Montour, but these are topics that are everywhere.
It's all across.
It's everywhere.
We just happen to be NorthcentralPa.com, so it just happens to be.
And the meeting was last night, and they had it. And so anyway.
All right. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Jeff Everett. He is Mark Messina, and we will see you all tomorrow.
Oh, here, I want to say one more thing before you sign off.
Oh, okay.
Look at what Mark's going to do, because Mark was yelled at this morning because he didn't turn his microphone off.
Yelled this
morning that we had to go on late because my microphone had to charge. So I want you to see right here. This is what I'm doing. Power button.
Did you press it? Did it come off? It looks like it's still on.
Do I need to let go?
You might need to. I'm not 100% sure, but you might.
With my computer, I don't. It won't go off.
Try it again. Hold it for like a little. Hold it.
I did.
Are you pressing the right one? I bet you're pressing the wrong one because that's.
Let's try this again. What's it? What?
Am I allowed to?
Oh, there we go. There we go. What's it mean?
Am I allowed to call you a boomer yet?
Listen, you know my technology challenges. I don't.
That might have been the most boomerish thing you've done.
And now you can't even hear me because my mic's off.
Everybody.